Brad asked me to give an introduction to hop IPM, and I thought it would be nice to start off talking a little bit about IPM in general. So where did this concept of integrated pest management come from? What are the ideas behind it? What's our history? How did we get here? I'll talk quite a bit about scouting in the hop yard. I understand Mary, I think, talked to you guys earlier about some pest identification and stuff, but we'll talk more in a general way about how to set up for scouting. And then we'll also go over some of the resources that are available. So the creation of modern agriculture. So really, we've been cultivating crops through our known history. We've been keeping livestock, cultivating crops, and over time, through mechanization, through the development of synthetic fertilizers, our fields or cropping systems have gotten larger and larger and larger. And Ann had that picture up there. It said monoculture and pest pressure on it. So as we've increased the scale of our agricultural production, the pressure from pests has increased over time. And so it really led to a need for the development of pesticides and pest control. And even though a lot of the pesticides we talk about today are in recent history, there are examples historically of pesticides being used for a long time. So even the Romans used sulfur as a pesticide. There are examples like a Bordeaux mixture, a copper mixture that's been used in grapes for hundreds of years. So pesticides aren't really new, but we've gotten a lot better at making very effective pesticides. And that's really led to over time is a heavy reliance on pesticide use. And that comes with a number of issues. Resistance is one of the issues that arises when we have heavy pesticide use. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but resistance develops over time with repeated exposure to the same mode of action. Pesticide residues became an issue. So we saw pesticide residue in the food chain, and we also saw worker exposure issues emerging. Pesticides affect natural processes. They can lead to the emergence of new pests. So oftentimes we don't necessarily think about it this way, but our crop that's out there is kind of a space or a habitat for these pests that we're often battling. And when we remove them from the system, we open up new real estate for different pests that are opportunistic and can move into those spaces. So oftentimes when we control one pest, we see a new one emerge to take its place. And then there were also, of course, non-target issues. So, that could include things like fish kills, or even some of the work that was done showing the link between DDT and a decline in bird populations because it affected essentially the thickness of the eggshell that was produced from exposed birds. So there was public concern, and that all kind of culminated in the 1960s. There was a really famous book that was published called Silent Spring. So Dr. Rachel Carson is the one who made that connection between the use of DDT and the decline in avian populations. And that really gave a kind of a rallying point for the public and for scientists as well, who were concerned about the amount of pesticides we were using and the way we were using them. So in 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed. Shortly thereafter, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act was made into law, and that is the law that governs all of our pesticides in the U.S. So it governs the registration of them and the use of them. In 1972, DDT was banned, and in that same year, the president made IPM national policy and established IPM programs around the country. And IPM was a concept that was developed by a group of entomologists in California with the idea that just spraying pesticides on a calendar basis is causing all of these issues, and we need to think of a different way to approach our pest management strategies on farm. And their idea was an integrated approach to management. So there's a lot of different definitions out there on what integrated pest management is, but this is a nice, believe it or not, this is a short version of what they have out there. It's a sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way to minimize the economic, health, and environmental risks. And I think this last sentence here is really important. Because oftentimes we think of integrated pest management and we think, oh, that's an environmentally sustainable way of managing pests on our farm. And that's true, it is an environmentally sustainable way of managing pests, but it's also an economically sustainable way and the way that minimizes health concerns, exposure concerns for growers or in the food chain as well. So those are equally important parts or goals of our IPM program. So IPM is a comprehensive program. It's very knowledge and information intensive. There are no easy answers to questions anymore. I think that historically one of the nice things about pest management back in the day was you looked at your calendar and you decided what you were going to spray based on the calendar. You know, it was June 1, so you went out and you put your application on for pest X. You didn't have to think about things too much. You didn't have to understand a lot about the pest biology or the rest of the ecosystem that you're dealing with, and that's no longer the case today. It's multidisciplinary. It focuses on multiple tactics. It's cognizant that 100% control isn't usually economical or necessary. It's based on the concept that cropping systems and pests are not static. Invasive pests are an example of this. In a lot of crops, we're dealing with a new invasive pest every few years, and that can really throw a wrench in our IPM programs or upset them for a little while, but then we come back to those tenets of IPM, we develop strategies for those new invasives and hopefully overcome them. It's applicable to a number of different sites, so commercial, ag, home gardens, horticulture, even public buildings. And it encompasses insects, pathogens, weeds, and even vertebrate pests. So there are really these four major tenets of integrated pest management programs. They use this acronym PAMS to help you remember. Prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression. So prevention includes the exclusion of plant pests. So obviously pests you can avoid bringing onto your property are the best pests to deal with, right? You just don't have to deal with them. And I think in hops, and I heard a number of speakers say this today, but pest-free planting material is a really critical step for hop producers, especially those that are just getting started. So getting clean plant material from reputable resources is a really important thing. I would talk to other growers about their experiences with different plant vendors before you select a vendor. There's a lot of variability in the market right now. And I would also consider ordering a small lot of plants from a vendor before you commit to a huge, 10-acre planting with somebody, really understanding that you're getting clean plant material. Prevention includes anticipating problems, so what pests have commonly occurred on a site. And in some cases, we can select resistant varieties. So this is a vine that's got symptoms of downy mildew. It's kind of stunted and chlorotic. And we have, this table, the field guide that you picked up today has this table that shows disease susceptibility in a number of common varieties. And it's pretty interesting because this, of course, was developed off of susceptibility information in the Pacific Northwest, but it's very reflective of what I see in the field in Michigan. So I definitely see Centennial as being very susceptible to downy mildew. We see a lot of downy on that. And those that are listed as more resistant or moderately resistant tend to do better in Michigan yards as well. So you may find that to be true here as well. Avoidance can include things like starting transplants in pathogen-free soil, sanitation like removing diseased plant material from the field. If you cut down vines with downy mildew, you want to remove that tissue from the site. Some people compost it. I would prefer it was burned or buried personally. That can be a source of inoculum down the road, but that's an example of avoidance, that good sanitation practice. And then following best management practices. Anne mentioned that they're going to be posting some best management practices on the Hop Growers page, the Hop Growers of America page, and I think that's going to be an awesome resource for us outside of the Pacific Northwest to have access to that information. We haven't really developed them here. We're not that far down the road yet, so anything we can learn and glean from their best management practices especially if some of you interested in maybe propagating hops as well, because that's what we're kind of seeing in Michigan. We have people who are planting hops for production, but they're also interested in propagating. And certainly their best management practices for propagation would be very helpful. Avoidance can include site selection. So planting in well-drained soils and providing adequate irrigation and nutrients is important. And that's really the idea of avoiding stressing the plant. So we see in Michigan when we plant on heavier ground or wetter ground, a number of issues arise. This is a common one, fusarium on hop. So this is a fungus that grows in girdles around the base of this vine, and it's right where the vine meets the crown. And about the time they hit the top wire, they really get to blowing in the wind, and it'll work itself loose and snap off right at the crown level. So that can be an issue on heavier ground. Site selection is important because you don't want to be fighting issues like that all the time. Of course, adequate irrigation and nutrients are critical too, to keeping hops out of stress, and they are really thirsty and they require a lot of nutrients. Avoidance can also include uniform stands of a competitive crop. So this is a farmer who uses cultivation for weed suppression in the rows. When his vines get to about 10 or 12 feet, he does do an AIM application, a burn down application to thin out that mat. But then he only does one application and he lets that mat develop underneath the vines and gets really excellent weed control from that. So, he's basically smothering the rest of the weeds. Now, I know you guys heard about Downy mildew quite a bit today already. One of the concerns with this is that we would create a microclimate in there that would be conducive to Downy. This is a little later in the season when he's doing this. And then this cultivation actually dries out the soil and causes drier soil conditions within the hop yard. So that's one of the reasons he does that, is to try to compensate for some of that environmental modification. Monitoring is another critical tenet. So observing pest populations or scouting regularly, and we'll talk about scouting in a few minutes here. Monitoring the weather is really important. That can tell us when we could expect potato leafhopper to arrive. If we've got some rainstorms or thunderstorms that are originating down by the Gulf states, that can give us an indication that leafhopper will be showing up soon. Nutrient and soil sampling, that's a form of monitoring, making sure that the plants are getting what they need. Proper identification of insect pests, diseases, so I think Dr. Gardner talked about that this morning. And then also remembering that we can have these abiotic causes of issues out there. So one of the calls that I get, and it's funny because it's usually from our more seasoned growers that really know how to identify pest and disease issues, and they'll call and say, man, I have this section of plants and they're just failing. I can't figure out what's going on with these plants. And we'll go out there and it's a plugged irrigation emitter or something like that that's not a disease that's causing that issue. Maybe it's low ground where you need some tiling or something to help shed off some of the water. But just keep in mind, everything isn't caused by a virus or an insect that we see in the field. So this is a graphic that's meant to talk about the economic components of an IPM program. For a lot of our pests and diseases and more established crops, we have these economic decision-making charts. And the way we usually talk about them in IPM is in the form of thresholds. So we might say, at 2 mites per leaf, we need to treat for this pest. Or when you have 80% disease incidence, that's when we treat. But it's based on this economic concept. We have the number of pests up here on the y-axis. The x-axis is time. You would expect those pests to continue to increase. And at some level, we get to the point where economic injury occurs, which is the amount of injury that justifies the cost of intervention. So it's when we're losing money if we don't do something about it, right? This line down here indicates the economic threshold. So this is where we want to treat to prevent ourselves from getting to the economic injury level. And this is really the backbone of our IPM decisions. And even though we don't have these developed for each pest yet, I still think it's a good thought exercise to go through when we're making management decisions on farm. So a lot of times we say things like, well, I put a spray on because it's going to help me sleep tonight, or I don't want to worry about that. I'm worried about what's coming down the pike, but we really have to make that consideration on an economic level as well. So successful IPM practitioners, they really understand pest life cycles, epidemiology, and the ecology that's going on. They monitor the whole system. They consider all the available tools, adhere to economic constraints. They use available technology, and they share information. I think it's great to have these meetings, have growers come together and talk about things. Certainly within the states, we share a lot of information. Brad's probably told you, but we meet monthly in the northeastern section of the country via conference call to talk about what's going on and to exchange ideas and information, to get ideas from each other. And certainly, your neighbors and other growers are going to be a great source of information for you. I also subscribe to all the different listservs around the region, so I like to hear what's coming on in Ohio, what's happening in Indiana. It gives me an idea of what to expect, and so that might be something that you'd be interested in doing as well. So we've got a number of HOP IPM resources and suppliers. We have a bookstore, MSUE bookstore. We've got some bulletins and other things available there. Hops.msu.edu is our main HOP website. We post everything on there, so any of the resources that we put out, 99% of them are free for download from our website. The MSUE News, I put together scouting reports all season long talking about what we're seeing in the field, how to deal with those pests. So if you're interested in that, you can sign up to receive that as just like an email that comes out when we've got something to talk about. We also have diagnostic services. I use diagnostic services quite a bit, especially with these new crops because there's so much we haven't seen before. So if you're unsure of something, you can certainly send something in. I think it's $20, so it's pretty reasonable to send something in. They'll give you a diagnosis and also recommendations. And then Great Lakes IPM is one of the vendors I've used in the past for like purchasing traps and hand lenses and things like that if you're interested in some of those IPM type supplies. So we'll talk a little bit about scouting for pests of hops, talk about scouting protocol. I'm going to zip through the primary pests because I understand you've already heard about those today, and then we'll talk about some of the scouting resources that we've got available. So scouting involves monitoring the crop and cropping areas for insects and diseases. It begins as soon as the plant begins to grow or that pest becomes active, and it typically continues until the crop is dormant or the risk of that pest has passed. It's a critical step in quantifying the damage that can be caused by a pest. It aids in determining if intervention to control the pest is warranted. And I think over time, that curve that we talked about with developing thresholds, I think over time we develop those for ourselves on our farm. So if we're going out and scouting and we see, okay, this year in June, I had 4 mites per leaf. And I had damage last year when I had 2 mites per leaf in June. So I know I have a large population of mites this year that has the capacity to do a lot of damage. That tells me I should put on a treatment. So there's always also this kind of long-term knowledge that we gain from scouting that can help in our decision-making practices. It helps growers determine the present life stage of the insect or disease, which can be critical to the proper selection and timing of management strategies, and it assists in determining the efficacy of a management strategy. So it's also important to go out after a treatment, of course, after the re-entry interval is passed, and check to see, did that treatment work? Did it knock back the leafhopper population, or did it slow down the mite reproduction out there? So it's always great to check back and ensure that our treatments are effective. Scouting for diseases includes monitoring the crop, both for signs and symptoms. So signs are like visible physical parts of the pathogen. So these are spore-bearing structures of downy mildew on the underside of the leaves here. Gives that dark, fuzzy gray appearance. This is a sign of a systemic downy mildew infection. So we see these short and internode links. There's a chlorotic coloring to the leaves are kind of yellowing there. So these are both indications of downy mildew infections. Scouting for insects includes looking for all life stages and attempting to quantify the population. It can also include inspecting for crop damage and setting traps to collect them. I do set out unbaited yellow sticky traps for potato leafhopper arrival, so those are just passive two-sided yellow traps that they seem to be attracted to. And it's a quick way to check and see what activity, what insects are present when you hit the hop yard. So I just change those out every week because they do get really dirty, but that's a really helpful way. And then for some of these insects, we really have to closely inspect the crop, right? They're really small in some cases. So these are potato leafhopper nymphs. The adults are much easier to see. They zip around a lot more. They go onto the upper leaf surface a lot more. The adults tend to be like a mint green color. Whereas if you look at these immature nymphs here, they're almost the same color as the leaf. They're extremely small. I mean, I don't even think this is a mid-vein of a hop leaf that we're seeing here. You can see all of the veination there, but very small and really require close inspection in some cases. It's important that growers keep records of their scouting. Maps of your fields can be helpful. A record of sampling and pest pressure, as well as your control measures utilized. So I always think, oh, I'll remember this next year, but I never do. I can't remember what miticide was used, or where that particular hot spot was, what variety got hardest hit. So anything you can do to bolster those records is really helpful. So I'd recommend sectioning your farm off into manageable portions based on location, size, and crop or variety, and you scout them essentially separately. So it's easier to deal with blocks that are less than 10 acres in size, and contain plants of the same variety, age, or spacing. And that's oftentimes also how we make our management decisions and our management programs. So that seems to work pretty well. If degree day tools or biological information are available to predict pest emergence or arrival of certain pests, then you can use them to gauge when you might scout more intensively. So it is time intensive to spend a large amount of time out there scouting. So if you can kind of identify those times when you need to maximize that effort, then that can be helpful as well. So for example, in Michigan, we use the seasonal primary pest occurrence chart to help growers determine when they need to look for what and how intensively. So we've got the dates up here. For you guys, we'd probably need to shift this back a few weeks, would be my guess. We have the average degree day accumulation and then growth stage of the plant, and that's just on average across years. So we look at downy mildew. We know that we're going to see systemic infections, that treatment window for systemic infections earlier. So we begin treatment in Michigan at 6 inches of growth. We talk to growers about getting out and looking for spikes. Some growers in the southern part of the state don't have snowpack, so they might go through and renovate at that time. There's some work out of Vermont that's shown crown renovation can help reduce downy mildew pressure. And then you can see what our biggest problem is with production. I mean, downy mildew just spans the whole rest of the season until harvest. So we're basically on a protectant spray strategy for the rest of the year. For two-spotted spider mites, we monitor for them early, so they actually overwinter as mated females on the trellis structure in the understory, and so they are ready to lay eggs as soon as temperatures warm. Mites are really temperature driven, and so she'll come out and be really active. They're quite orange up by us in Michigan. I don't know if you guys see that here, but they're very orange at that time of the year. And you can also look for eggs. So that gives you an idea of where you're at in the season as well. So those females overwinter, if you start to see eggs, you know those females have been out and active for a little while. Potato leafhopper, we scout carefully following spring storms. Potato leafhopper don't overwinter in Michigan. I'm guessing they don't overwinter here either. Is that correct? Do you guys know? Yeah, it gets pretty cold, so they actually are residents in the Gulf states, but those storms that sweep up actually carry adult potato leafhoppers, and they're essentially deposited in our fields as those spring storms roll through. So that's when we emphasize scouting for those, is following those spring storms. Rose Schaefer, we see those emerge in June. Japanese beetle are a little later in July, and they both have about 6 weeks of peak activity. We talk about walking a transect and an edge in scouting. So if this was your whole field here, you'd want to walk a diagonal right across it as well as an edge. Oftentimes we see the most downy mildew on the interior of a block. That's where that microclimate occurs, that humidity is at its highest. And we might get a little bit less spray coverage in the center than we do on some of the edges. And then we tend to see more mites on the edge rows. So mites, like that dusty tractor alley for some reason, they tend to be more prevalent in that area. So all that to say, there are different kind of microclimates within a block that cause different pests to occur at different areas. So we want to make sure that we're getting a good cross section as we're walking through it. It's good to change the path that you walk each time you scout to inspect new areas, so we're not, kind of missing something over here in the corner because we don't ever walk to the far end of the field. Revisit problem areas that you've had. This almost always happens. You end up with that one hot spot where you always have mites, or that one area where you always find the first potato leafhopper. Those are good ways to maximize your scouting time, are to check those areas. And again, making up a scouting sheet and keeping good records. Okay, so this is the question that I get a lot. So wait, what am I looking for, though, when I'm out there scouting, walking through the hop yard? And I think it's one of the harder questions to answer, especially with hops. I mean, at the end of the season, hop plants kind of look pretty beat up. I mean, they aren't pristine by any means, but what we're really looking for is anything out of the ordinary. Again, we got the scouting report. There are Facebook pages if you'd prefer to get your news that way. So Ohio has one, Michigan State has one, the HOP IPM field guide you've got, and then of course the Ohio State page is available as well. So I know you learned about these, so I'll kind of skip through these, but maybe talk just a little bit about some of the scouting protocol for this. So downy mildew is something, unfortunately, we're all extremely familiar with. We thankfully only see this asexual phase here in Michigan. We don't have the resting spore phase. So we essentially have these systemically infected plants. As the plants expand, fungal colonies develop on the plant parts and produce spores that are then transferred to new healthy tissue where they cause infection and produce spores. So there's kind of this cyclical life cycle that goes on during the season. Infection is favored by mild to warm temperatures, 60 to 70 degrees, when free moisture is present for an hour and a half. Leaf infection can occur at temperatures as low as 41 when wetness persists for 24 hours. So this is spring in the Midwest. So that is why we have such an issue with downy mildew here. It's really capable of growing at what we think of as pretty cold temperatures for fungi. Initially, it looks like a spike early in the season. They can then appear stunted, brittle, or distorted. I find that the appearance of downy mildew infections is highly variable. It was really interesting when I first started working on this crop. It was like I'd find all these things wrong, and I kept sending them to the diagnostics clinic, and they were all downy mildew. And I kept expecting them to be different things. But throughout the season, it really takes different forms, and it can look quite different. So here's an early season downy infection. I think this is Chinook that I have here. We've got these really pretty angular lesions that you see on the upper side of the leaf. You can actually see it's not crossing leaf venation. And as you flip it over, you can see that tail gray tufting on the underside. Here we see a bind that has failed to climb the string. That's also what downy mildew can do. So this one's just fallen off the side. The underside or understory of this plant down here was quite clean. So it was pretty surprising to see that difference there. This is downy mildew on Columbus. So this is, I think, a later season infection that occurred here. You can see these pinpoint lesions that are pretty similar to what we saw in the first slide, but then what's a little harder to see here is there's some browning or reddening in those bract leaves, and those are downy mildew infections in those bract leaves, which is a real problem because, of course, these are our cones developing right beneath them. So we saw cone infection in sites like this. This is interesting. This is a sidearm that had this, and initially I thought it might be mechanical damage from the tractor or the sprayer going through. We use air blast sprayers, and we really nail those bines when we go by. And so I thought maybe the pressure was a little too high at this grower's. Downy mildew. So it's in that spray zone, so we think maybe we're getting a little bit of mechanical damage, and it's making that sidearm prone to downy mildew infection. So varietal susceptibility is important, and I know we've said this like 15 times today, but I think it is so critical for us in this region. In the Pacific Northwest, downy mildew is not a big issue. Powdery mildew is primarily what they breed for. It's what historically the fungicide programs have been set up around, and so we really need to think about the varieties we plant. Charlie Rower had a nice slide today, and he said, you need to pick your variety based on what you can be successful growing and where that overlaps with what brewers will buy from you. And those are equally important things to consider. So again, look at that disease susceptibility chart before you make your decision. We utilize a protectant fungicide strategy season long for downy mildew control. Organic production is a real challenge for hop growers. We have a few that are sticking with it in Michigan and really making a go of it, and we have a few who are transitioning to conventional because it's just been too difficult. Okay, so we talked about that. We're applying fungicides on a protectant basis, season long, every 7 to 10 days. There are several critical periods in the season, before and after training, at lateral branch development, bloom, and cone development. There's a lot of available fungicides. I won't go through all of them, except to say, for some reason, Flint and Pristine has been showing up in a lot of my growers spray programs, and I just want to mention that Flint and Pristine will only suppress downy mildew. It's really a powdery mildew material. So if you have powdery mildew, that's fine. We don't see much of that in the field in Michigan, but just keep in mind these are really the classes we're looking at for downy mildew. So sometimes we need curative sprays, so that means a fungicide with some kickback action. So maybe we couldn't get out and spray at that 10-day interval and we got a bunch of rain and it's humid and you're concerned. If that's an issue, then you might want to consider some of these different pesticides that I've listed here for you. They have some post-infection activity. So those are systemic fungicides. They move into the plant material and they can kind of catch that fungus while it's growing in the plant. They have variable lengths of post-infection activity that you can look at here. And then importantly as well, they have different lengths of protectant activity moving forward. So that's going to be a consideration that you want to think about. Organic growers have fewer options, really need to focus on keeping tissue protected. Copper-based products are the mainstay of a downy mildew program for organic growers. One of the issues we face with this is there are limitations in the pounds of copper that you can apply per season, and we run out of copper in Michigan. We need about 2 times the amount that we have available to us per year. And so we do supplement with some of these other products, Actinovate, Ecomate, Armacarb, and Sonata. Those also list downy mildew on the label and are approved for organic use in hop, but we don't have any efficacy data on those. We're really utilizing those because we don't have enough copper at this time to get through the season. So just a little bit about that, we do have 2 pathogens, downy and powdery. They look a lot different though. Downy's dark, it's on the underside of the leaf. Powdery's white, it's got circular lesions, and it's on the upper leaf surface. Okay, so I think you guys talked about all of these. Just some pictures of potato leafhopper here. There's a nice up close one. Again, this is how I'm scouting. I'm shaking bines, flipping leaves over, and looking closely. We think hop plants can probably tolerate some level of feeding, and that it might be variety dependent. There's actually a new publication I haven't had time to dig through yet out of Vermont looking at cultivar susceptibility to potato leafhoppers. So again, grab that paper offline before you make those varietal selections and consider potato leafhopper susceptibility. We've got a lot of things we can use to manage leafhopper. One of the common insecticide classes that we talk about over and over in hops is pyrethroids. So there are probably 40 different labels that have a pyrethroid as their active ingredient. And they're inexpensive and they're pretty effective at killing the target pest. But we do see some issues when we use pyrethroids in hops, primarily with two-spotted spider mites. So they're really hard on beneficial mites, those predatory mites we talked about. And so sometimes we actually see a kind of a rebound in that pest mite population. So it'll dip when we apply the pesticide, but then we also kill the beneficial mites. So when it rebounds, it kind of comes back with vengeance. So keep that in mind. There are some OMRI-approved chemicals or chemistries that are also available. Here we see two-spotted spider mite. They affect the photosynthetic ability of the leaf. It can be an issue for brewers, so brewers don't want to dump a bunch of dead mites into their brewing line, obviously. It can also affect the shelf life or storability of hops. So here we see some symptoms of two-spotted spider mite damage. It's the underside of a leaf that's been infested. You can see it's really kind of dirty, dusty, so they do have a webbing associated with them. This is a two-spotted spider mite here. These are like grains of sand right here. So they're really quite small. A hand lens, a magnifying lens is very useful in seeing them. I find once you get kind of your eye trained for the season, you can start to see them with the naked eye. So we talked a little bit about this, that they are overwinters mated females. This is, I think, a really critical piece of information. So the females that overwintered lay eggs. The larvae emerge from the egg in just 2 to 5 days, depending on temperatures, and they develop into adults in 1 to 3 weeks. So you have a life cycle that can occur literally in 2 to 3 weeks here with two-spotted spider mites if temperatures are warm. So they like temperatures all the way up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They'll continue to reproduce more quickly until that upper threshold of 100 degrees. So the nice thing about two-spotted spider mites in Michigan is we tend to not get that super heat, obviously, like they do in Yakima Valley, and we tend to get quite a bit of rain. And rain actually washes spider mites off the leaves. So hopefully spider mites will be an occasional pest, especially during seasons where we have weather, hot, dry weather that's conducive to their development. But in some years, we might have pretty low levels of spider mites. So for scouting, I focus sampling on the lower dense canopy. I evaluate 2 leaves from 20 plants per yard. That's a minimum. There are thresholds you'll read about from the Pacific Northwest. I don't think they're applicable here. They're dealing with extreme resistance issues in the Pacific Northwest, so they're really trying to conserve insecticide or miticide use out there. In Michigan, we found that a well-timed spray for us, what's in essentially mid to late June, can provide season-long control of mites when we're utilizing true miticides. So I've listed a few true miticides here. I understand one of the, I think a chem rep that we had here today was talking about that acromite might not be labeled here in Ohio. So again, check on all these labels before you purchase the product to use on farm. But these true miticides are highly effective at killing those pest mites, and they are less toxic, much less toxic to the beneficial predatory mites. So they need to be ingested to be effective. So if a mite isn't munching on a leaf, it's not going to get affected by these miticides. Hop aphids, Anne touched on these too. They excrete that honeydew, which is essentially aphid poop. It's high in sugar, and it's a great growth medium for sooty mold. And so it's a real issue for quality. It's got kind of a complicated life cycle. It starts on cherry in the spring. There's a female there that produces a generation of unwinged females. Then as things warm up, they move on to hot plants. They produce, again, unwinged females until fall, and then they'll produce a winged generation that goes back to cherry. So it's something that we can really only target in season. I tend to see it most often on nursery plants. So the greenhouse is a great place for aphids. It's got all the environmental conditions they like. A lot of times when we bring them into the field in Michigan, it's a problem that kind of subsides on its own over time. I think just the environmental pressures of being outside the greenhouse have something to do with that. We do recommend controlling before the flowering stage. Essentially what you're trying to do here is keep that honeydew and sooty mold off of the cones that are developing. Rose chafer and Japanese beetle, they're generalist feeders. They feed on a lot of things, including hops. I've lumped them together here because they really are treated the same way. We scout for them the same way. They have a grub stage. Their larva feeds on the roots of grass. So if you have fallow fields or grassy areas, you might see more around your area. In Michigan, we see rose chafer in June, Japanese beetle in early July. And again, they have about 6 weeks of activity. They're around longer than that, but that's kind of when the peak occurs. We visually observe these. They aggregate into large groups. You typically don't see them hanging around alone. So they're usually in groups, mating and feeding. And they release an aggregation pheromone essentially to pull others into the group. And so they're really difficult to treat for. They're really frustrating to treat for because you can treat for them, you kill what's there, but that pheromone trail is still out there and you see reinfestation pretty quickly. Here's Japanese beetle. It's got that really pretty emerald green color. It's got the brownish orange wing covers. And then the white tufts along the abdomen are actually what we use as a diagnostic characteristic. Here the feeding, very similar. Pretty tough to tell the feeding apart unless you actually see the insect. We don't have established thresholds, but I would say that, you know, young, limited leaf area plants are going to be more susceptible because you're concerned about removal of leaf area. But we all know how vigorous hops are. So if you have well-established vines, they can take a lot of feeding damage before you're concerned. The only exception to that would be if you see them feeding on flower parts. Obviously, we don't want them damaging the crop. So again, there's some OMRI-approved products. Surround is one that you may see come up in regards to rose chafer and Japanese beetle. That's a kaolin clay product. It forms a particle film. It's an irritant, and basically they don't want to hang out on your hop plant if it has Surround on it. But it does not wash off of cones, so we don't want to apply Surround after burst stage. So our registered pesticide sheet at MSU. Just a couple more slides here to get through. Some management considerations for your IPM program, the necessity of application, resistance management. We'll talk about the outcomes of the application. So this is the example I really just gave with Japanese beetle, but consider the following before making a treatment. Does it make economic sense? Are the plants small or well established? So that would come back to Japanese beetle. Are the plants healthy and thriving, or are they struggling? You know, how conservative do I need to be with my management strategies based on the shape my plants are in? What's the historical pest pressure on the site? Sometimes we need to make our decisions based on history, not on what we're actually seeing in the field, and that's okay. That's really using our knowledge to make an educated decision about what we think is best out there. So, you know, Downy mildew is one of those. We know it's going to come, so we spray for it. We don't wait to see the symptoms. Pesticide resistance, so, you know, as a young industry, we have a real chance here to kind of do things right in terms of pesticide resistance to stave that off, especially for downy mildew management. Pesticide resistance describes the decreased susceptibility of a pest to a pesticide that used to be effective at controlling that pest. So what happens during the development of resistance is, so say over here, this whole grouping are all the insects we have in a field, all the Japanese beetle. This Japanese beetle has a genetic mutation, a naturally occurring genetic mutation that means it's not susceptible to the insecticide we're going to use. We spray that insecticide, we kill most of his buddies, but he is alive and lives to procreate, right? So he has more offspring in that new next generation of Japanese beetle. And over time, when we apply that same insecticide, we select for that same genotype within that group of insects, and we see a decrease in the efficacy over time. So when we apply this pesticide here, all of a sudden we're saying, well, geez, we're only getting like 50% of the control that we used to. Well, half of our population is now resistant to that pesticide. So the factors that affect resistance development include use of similar modes of action, the frequency of application, so how often am I putting this on, the persistence of the chemical in the environment, is it a long residual period that it's present, and the pest rate of reproduction and number of offspring. So this is really kind of the lottery system we're talking about here with pesticide resistance development. So the more offspring we have, the more chance that we have that low rate of natural mutation is met and we get that offspring that's resistant. Managing pesticide resistance. Don't make successive applications of the same pesticide. Most of our fungicides and insecticides now have a group number on the label. That group number is an indicator of the mode of action of that pesticide. You don't want to make successive applications that have that same number. Now that's not between fungicides and insecticides, it's just within that group. Follow label directions for resistance management. They often limit the number of applications you can make in a season for that reason. Use tank mixes with multi-site partners. So a lot of times we put copper in the tank. With our narrow spectrum fungicides, copper is a broad spectrum, to help clean that up. So if we had for example, two insecticides in this tank, what's the chance that that guy's going to be resistant to both of them? Pretty low, right? So we're able to kind of suppress that pressure, that insecticide pressure on that. And then recognize the signs of pest resistance. It can be a sudden loss of control or it can be a gradual loss. And again, that's where that scouting again becomes really useful. So this is just an example I wanted to show. These are fungicides labeled for use on hop in Michigan. So we've got them organized by single site, multi-site. There's some that are pre-mixes now just to add to the confusion. And then we've got these plant defense inducers. So this gives you an idea of, which ones you would want to rotate through. Additionally, we put the FRAC code, that's the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee code, that tells you the mode of action. And you can see some of them have the same mode of action there. So we'd want to avoid successive applications. Consider the outcomes of an application before making a treatment. Can this application control more than one target pest? Rose Schaefer and Japanese beetle are a great example of this. Same spectrum of pesticides in terms of activity, and we have a period where they overlap in the season. Can we wait until we start to see Japanese beetle emerge before we make that Rose Schaefer application? Kind of two birds with one stone type of idea. How should I position my applications to optimize control and minimize use? How will beneficial insects be affected? And are there implications for pollinators? Most of our insecticides now have a beneficial insect toxicity rating associated with them. We have it in our spray guide. There might be one in the book that you received, that IPM guide. I believe that has some toxicity information. So when you're making those pesticide decisions, and you have a list of 15 things that you could use, cross-check those with that list and pick the one that's going to be least impactful on those beneficials. Some pest management considerations specifically for new growers. Get your pesticide applicators licensed. I'm not very familiar with the Ohio system, but it's really important that you have that applicator license. There's a lot of education that goes on when you're getting that license about safety for yourself as well as the environment. And I put up there for that reason organic producers too. So just like Ann said, of course, organic producers do apply pesticides. Carefully consider the current limitations of organic production. I'd say ask around, talk to some growers that are trying to do it and see what the major challenges are. Have a tractor and a sprayer on farm before planting. That seems intuitive, but that's an expensive cost when we're starting a new farm. But it's really critical to being able to adequately care for the crop. Carefully select those cultivars. Again, can't emphasize that enough. Making sure that the vendor you're getting your plants from is a reliable quality vendor that's really been vetted by other growers.